Well, hello there. This is Dr. Charles Cunha. I'm basically doing a speech about procedural justice and law enforcement. First off, I'd like to thank the Ohio Committee on Criminal Justice and Education program or administration for allowing me to speak at their conference this weekend. I'd like to also thank them for publishing a short journal article that I wrote regarding procedural justice and law enforcement. That is what my speech is about today. Let me grab my PowerPoint for you guys. Excuse me if I may appear a little nervous. It's because I am. So this might take a little bit of the PowerPoint. Let's see. All right. See how I can share this. Let's see. Okay. Oh, I guess I can't share it. I'm not sure. I'm new to this, so this is my first time. So anyways, let's see. What else can I do here? Shoot. All right, well, I'll just go ahead and talk to you about it. I'll have my slides up so I can read them. Wow. Okay, here we go. So again, let's get started. All right, so you guys can probably see my slides right now. Here we go. Okay, again, I'm Dr. Charles Cunha. I have a PhD in criminal justice, a graduate of Capella University. Basically, today I'm going to speak to you about procedural justice and so forth. First off, I'd like to thank the Ohio Committee on Criminal Justice Education for allowing me to speak this weekend. Also want to thank them for publishing my short journal article on which my speech is about today. Again, I may appear a little nervous. That's because I am. I've never spoken in front of a large crowd like this before, and so forth. So I'm going to talk about procedural justice and police-citizen encounters. Basically, the research was on procedural justice, and procedural justice basically is a theory or philosophy which has 4 principles. And basically, procedural justice has been proven to improve police-community relations and so forth. So that is where the interactions between police officers and citizens and so forth deal with the procedural justice principles. Procedural justice principles are voice, respect, dignity, neutrality, meaning make decisions without bias by the police officer, and then fostering trust between the community and police officers, right, and so forth. So the purpose of the research was basically to answer the research question is, what are the reasons law enforcement officers are practicing or are not practicing procedural justice in their daily duties in police-citizen encounters? So through this research, we're able to answer that question and so forth. The background, basically, the reason for the study was because of past incidents in history, which have demonstrated that police-community relations have been diminished, right? Been hampered by alleged illegitimate practices by police and so forth. This dates back to the 1960s, right? Which also has been caused for presidential administrations to enact legislation. So if we go back into the 60s, we look at President Lyndon B. Johnson, who helps investigate this phenomenon with the Cunha Commission. Through that commission, we found that a lot of African American communities felt that the police were prejudiced and racist and so forth. Prior or more moving towards more modern day America policing, we have former President Barack Obama take interest and apply a task force. He applies the 21st century policing task force, and in that task force he has community members, law enforcement officials, advocates, stakeholders like academia and so forth, research what the problem is. And through that research, they came up with 6 pillars of how they can improve policing. And in those pillars, you have the first pillar talks about improving community relations, and in that pillar, you have procedural justice principles. Procedural justice principles, again, it goes back to the 1990s, maybe late 80s, where it talks about how an individual is more satisfied with an encounter or an interaction when they feel that the authoritative figure acts legitimately. So dealing with whether a person is ticketed or arrested, as long as they've been treated fairly, right? There's no bias, no racism. They're treated with respect, dignity, and they're allowed to tell their side of the story through voice, then they were more satisfied with the interaction, so forth. So in our research, the methodology we used was qualitative exploratory case study of California law enforcement officers' perceptions, opinions, and lived experience with the use of procedural justice in police's encounters. So what we did was what I did was I interviewed police officers and asked them questions about what was their perception about using procedural justice, what was their perception about the training, what was their perceptions about their department, their departments, and how procedural justice training was implemented, and so forth. The results. What I did was I came up with 4 central themes based off of my interview questions to these research participants, and I came up with 4 general themes based off of the interview questions and where I met what they call saturation in research. And saturation basically is meeting, to a point where I can predict what other participants will say, because I've had so many participants say that already. So like in my research, I will get to this later a little bit more too, but after so many interviews, I could say that, well, I could predict more than likely any other participants would likely say the same thing. So we'll get to that and so forth. So the next steps were going to be from here. We'll talk about this. The next steps from here will be more police research for procedural justice, creating more policy or revising policy, improving policy procedures as well, using procedural justice principles along with police strategies, right, and so forth, and then strategizing, or making revisions to strategies, and so forth. Let's see. So what is procedural justice? Kind of mentioned that already. Procedural justice is, again, basically a theory or philosophy that when an individual feels that they're treated fairly in an interaction, no matter the outcome, they feel satisfied, right? So when we're looking at police community relations, we're looking at, well, when the community member feels they were treated fairly, they were given a voice, allowed to tell their side of the story. Um, the officer made decision without any racism or any bias in the decision, and there's some the citizen felt there's some kind of trust between the two, right? So when a citizen feels that way, then they feel that they're more satisfied. And research has demonstrated that, going back to late 80s, early 1990s, and Tom Tyler's research initially. And procedural justice isn't only research isn't only in policing, but it started out in being in the court system, right? Judges and prosecutors and so forth. So again, the 4 principles of procedural justice are voice, allowing the citizen to tell their side of the story, dignity, respect. Treating the officer, treating the person with dignity and respect, right? Respecting respecting them, and so forth. And then neutrality. Again, the officer making decision without any bias, right? There's been a lot of question as far as implicit bias when officers make decisions. Implicit bias is basically all it is you have a bias and you tend to lean that way, and it could be in anything, not just racism or about someone's race or anything, but maybe even that they look like a gang member, or you think they're a gang member, right? And it could be anything as simple as you preferring chocolate cake over cheesecake or something, right? That's all implicit bias is. You have that bias, you tend to lean that way. And then you have trust. Trust basically is through these interactions where you use the other 3 principles, you will foster trust because the person will feel satisfied in the encounter, even if you were to give them a ticket or make an arrest, right? Or search them, whatever it might be, as long as they felt that you were acting legitimately, which is what the principles do for police officers, then they would feel satisfied. And that's basically all that procedural justice has done, and so forth, right? So how did we get here? Well, we got here through research. The research methodology, I say we did a qualitative case study. How did we get through that? Well, we had to gather participants. So I used purposive expert sampling. Basically, according to past qualitative case study researchers, it's the ability, by using purposive expert sampling, we reduce researcher bias and discover research participants' real experiences and opinions, right? In getting those research participants, we had to ensure that we got informed voluntary consent. So we had to make sure that we protected the participants. We had to get their consent to participate. They had to agree to participate. They also had to be informed of what the research was about, and so forth. And they also had to mention any things that may be a concern for them. Maybe in this case, we really had minimal to no harm, no risk of harm in the research, because we weren't really, going too in depth into things. We weren't doing anything physically. We're just asking about their perceptions. However, if there were to be a situation where maybe the officer was explaining something that they were trying to talk to us about, and it brought back some type of memory or something, well, that could be an issue. So that's why they had to be informed of what the questions would be about, and so forth, and what it entailed. So in this research, we didn't have anything like that. All of our research participants were protected in that regard. We made sure we also made sure keeping research participants' information, names, identity confidential, and so forth, right? By doing that, we basically enabled us to do that was we got our institutional review board approval from the Capella University. We also followed the Belmont report practices and so forth. And then we also went through the city training, which is human research training, and so forth, as far as what we could and cannot do, which references the Belmont a lot. You have and so forth. So it talks about uh, the voluntary and consent, talks about confidentiality of the research, talks about any conflicts of interest, which there were none. Researcher, I wasn't associated with any, affiliated with any of the departments, and so forth. So there's no conflict of interest, and so forth. By the end of the study, we had 12 research participants, which basically all we did was we interviewed the 12 research participants. Prior to the interviews, we reviewed department policy, we reviewed post standards training regarding procedural justice, or principal policing as the departments call it. We reviewed their agency's policy on procedural justice or principal policing, and so forth. And then we interviewed the 12 participants one at a time. We recorded the interviews. It was done remotely, because of the research was being conducted during the pandemic, the emergency pandemic of the COVID-19. So we did interviews remotely through a Cisco WebEx meeting room. Only the audio was recorded, no video, just audio recorded. And the inclusion and exclusion criteria for that was we focused on law enforcement officers who had more than 5 years of experience, right? And they were trained on procedural justice or principal policing. If they didn't have 5 years or they didn't have the procedural justice training, then they were excluded from the research. As we learned, though, California post peace officer standard training had already created training and videos for the officers. Departments had already created policies and training. It was already in the police academy. 2015, Kamala Harris, and she was a former Attorney General Kamala Harris of California, had passed legislation, AB 1118, I think it was, for law enforcement academies and law enforcement general in California to create training for police officers in police academies. So since then, they've been training and doing all that. So it would have been, probably unheard of if an officer hadn't had some kind of training in the principal policing. Out of these interviews, we had 12 participants. We felt that at 12 participants, we had enough for the study. According to State Indian, their research participants, you don't need a large number, especially when you're doing a qualitative case study. Again, in saturation, we could determine that after so many interviews, we met saturation, in that we could predict what the other participants would say, and so forth. So here we said 12 because it was determined that saturation was met at our 6th interview, right? So what I did was I reviewed all the interviews going forward, interview 1 to 6, and I looked at all the themes, and it said they all pretty much said the same thing in their own words, of course. And then what I did was I reversed the order, so I went from 12 to backwards now. So at interview 7, I determined I have saturation. So basically, research has demonstrated that appropriate depth was reached, allowing social scientists to make sense of data and describe the data. So using this process, moving forward in your interviews, determining so many interviews that you succeeded with saturation, and then reversing the order. So that was demonstrated through prior research and so forth. So I used that as my rationale to say, well, I'm complete with gathering research participants and data. So again, that was sent up to the committee, and it was reviewed and it was accepted. It made sense. So let's see. Basically, out of the study I wanted to get, and why I used qualitative case study, because I wanted real perspectives and real life opinions from police officers to sample, right? Out of that, I was able to gather 4 central themes, right? That California law enforcement officers practice procedural justice. The practice of procedural justice and use of force, they go together. And then socialization is another theme. And then another thing came out of it was in-person training compared to online training. All right, so those were the themes that I got out of my questions, right? Those were the things that were most talked about, right? And so forth, and things of that nature. Again, we use qualitative case study, research methodology, and design. We interviewed the law enforcement officers. Again, prior to that, I reviewed department training curricula and department policies and procedures. Again, I came up with these 4 main themes. Law enforcement officer practice procedural justice. Was one theme. Practicing procedural justice and use of force was another theme. Socialization, and then training in procedural justice. So here, the research participants, this gives you an idea of what the demographics of the research participants. Again, it gives the age, their race or ethnicity, their gender, years of service that they've had, and then their assignment, and so forth. So it had a pretty good, a diverse population of assignments, right, and duties, and so forth. So there may be difference between patrol, training bureau, background unit. But again, we're looking at all types of citizen interaction, right? So, so forth. So, and things of that nature. Let's see my findings here. This basically talks to you about, this chart throws you my themes. It's that was extrapolated from the data. Again, the force gives you the 4 central themes, and it tells you how many participants out of the 12 I mentioned, said the same thing about those themes. Because the themes are basically topics that we talked about, and where everybody said similar things about them, that they do practice procedural justice, that procedural justice and use of force, it can work together. And not all the time, but it can work. And they all said that. So, and then socialization. In this one, socialization, we talk about our theoretical framework, I want to call it. So social bond theory, social learning theory. And all that is amounts to socialization. You also can use differential association theory, because it talks about, all 3 of those theories talk about how individuals learn behavior, how individuals, participate in certain behavior based on their bonds. Social bond theory comes from Travis Hershey in 1969, when he tries explaining juvenile delinquency, right? He talks about juvenile delinquency and talks about 4 bonds achieved for using or use it to explain police officers' misbehavior, right? If you did research on that, and so forth. Through my interviews, I didn't find any of that anybody talked about misbehavior or anything like that. So that was not part of my study, and so forth. It was all positive about using procedural justice. So the theoretical framework, again, we talked about social theories, social bond theory, Travis Hershey, 1969. Social learning theory, Albert Bandura, and then we talk about differential association theory, Edward Sutherland, and then we talk about socialization. Again, all 3 apply: social bond theory, social learning theory, differential association theory, and all that amounts to police culture, their relations, training, procedural duties carried out, right, and so forth. So again, police officers are a small group. In some cases, they could be considered a gang, right? While they learn from each other, they're going to learn good habits from their superior officers who train them, and then so you have attachment, commitment, belief, right, and so forth. So in all those, then you have the social learning theory, and you have your frequency of interactions, which is part of differential association theory. So police officer, you can use those theories to explain that. Prior research has used there is not a large amount of theory using um, these social perspectives or there's theoretical framework, but there is some research on that. So it talks about misbehavior by police officers. So and so forth. But so that's what we kind of talked about that. When we look at it, we come up with this diagram, which I created. I kind of made it myself using the four social bonds. So attachment, commitment, involvement, belief. Right. Well, in attachment, we have emotions and closeness. So you know you have when you're dealing with your supervisors or your peers, you have emotions, you have closeness, and so here's an attachment that you feel, and how you learn and how you socialize. And in commitment, you have career success. You are committed to your career, committed to being successful. All right. And these are all strong bonds. And then your involvement with your agency, the training, the policies and procedures, the culture that you become involved with because you're there. And then belief, use of procedural justice, and using procedural justice, treating people fairly. So these four bonds, which are the same bonds that Travis Hershey used to explain delinquency, I use them to help explain police culture, police behavior in a positive manner, right? Because again, from my research, my interview questions, nothing negative came out about how they used or didn't use procedural justice and stuff and so forth. So they all were positive things about procedural justice, and they practice it. There may have been things where they said, well, in some cases it doesn't work, but the majority of the time it can. Like nothing is always going to work all the time, right? So you can apply these bonds. If these bonds stay strong, then you can continue to use the procedural justice and be fair and legitimate. However, if they turn, for some reason they become weak, maybe through whatever case, and then there could be, then that could be a negative thing, right, and so forth. But these also apply to your social learning theory, your differential association theory, and so forth, right? So these are my findings of the four central themes law enforcement officers practice procedural justice. These are quotes from officers from the interviews. This is something we have always been doing. Procedural justice is a repackaging of community relations. Procedural justice is a new term for us in the last 3 years, and they all have to do with treating others as you would want to be treated. The procedural justice training has been positive. I have participated in hours of training. It has opened me up to new thought processes and new ways of looking at it. Another participant says, it's good to practice procedural justice because it can impact the outcome of the interaction. Procedural justice can de-escalate the situation. Procedural justice has an impact in the community. It is interesting because we have core values that we created and have been around for over a decade now. I feel like we are ahead of the game in taking this seriously. Our core values align with procedural justice tenets. So, in this point, it's the point was that, well, policing, law enforcement officers always practice procedural justice in a way. We just never called it that, right? Our core values and our mission it implies that you treat people with respect, you treat people with dignity, and so forth. You allow them to speak. You say their side of the story. You foster trust. And it's just a new way of saying what we've been doing all along. Is basically what the theme was here. Practice procedural justice and use of force. Again, these are some quotes. I would say that procedural justice puts me in a safer position. And if used correctly, it can prevent maybe using force, would ease the encounter, and the level of risk can drop when using procedural justice. Procedural justice can reduce officer safety issues and the use of force. Although there are instances procedural justice will not work, it does not work in all scenarios. It is a great tool otherwise. We use certain checklists as we are dealing with people. This is a time when a threat assessment comes into play. Procedural justice may not work anymore, and you must use force. Afterward, you attempt to converse with them. So in this one, again, there may be times if you're using procedural justice principles, you can reduce the chance of having to use force, and so forth. Even if and then they say it may not work all the time, but even if you did have to use force, you can still revert back to the procedural justice principles during the time you're using force and afterwards, right? And so forth. So that's all that they're saying there. So they feel that it can help in some situations. In other situations, you may still have to use force. You're not going to be able to persuade the person without using force. But in using force, you're still remaining a professional, and you're still treating the person humanely, right? You're not using excessive force, not using foul language. You're not trying to hurt them more than you should. Things of that nature. And when it's over, you may still allow them to say their side, right? Speak their side, and so forth. And again, in using the force and everything, you're not making a decision based on any prejudice or bias. Here, socialization. We talk about this theme. Basically, again, more quotes. Our core values align with the procedural justice tenets. Our culture here embraces our core values, which are the same as the procedural justice tenets, which are those four: respect, dignity, voice, neutrality, trust. Right. The policy at the Department on Procedural Justice is in their bias-based policing policy. In that policy, the department's mission statement and core values guide the LEOs in acting legitimately. So in this agency, because we had two agencies, this was they use what they call a bias-based policing is what they use, was the term they use, not principled policing or procedural justice. Socialization impacts procedural justice in a sense, but those who want to follow the crowd, but are independent. We have a strong personality quality standard in our department, which is the guiding force of how we are supposed to respond to others. Continued training deals with diversity, navigating diversity, respecting others' cultures, and dealing with other employees as well. So again, when we socialize, we socialize in the manner that is professional and respectful of others, right? And things of that nature. Our department is committed to training in and practicing the four principles of procedural justice as much as we can. We are teaching our LEOs that, and we are enforcing what we have always done. So again, the leadership in these departments are making sure that all the other officers and new recruits are aware that procedural justice is the future, right? It's something that we need to practice, something that they need to use when they're in the field dealing with people, whether it be a victim, witness, suspect, right, or just in a consensual encounter, a community member who has a concern, right? We take the time to be professional and treat them with respect, according to the four principles of procedural justice. Finally, we promote the practice of procedural justice in its four tenets because we are responsible for the younger LEOs and those on the shift. If you have a sergeant who does not emulate the principles of procedural justice very well, it will reflect in the way he supervises. Young men and women may not understand the supervisors. Supervisors help set the tone. Supervisors do not buy into the principle of procedural justice, and their officers will not. So again, this is coming from a sergeant, I believe, and he's saying that, if the sergeant isn't going to practice procedural justice, whether it be with other officers or in the field, well, then his LEOs aren't going to do that. So the supervisors and upper level managers really are the ones who have to, make sure that there's buy-in with this, that they believe that procedural justice works and that they're going to use it. And they practice and they show by example by practicing those procedural justice principles, right? So the officers will do it. Training of procedural justice, again, quotes, the in-person training was effective and engaging. The training was versatile. It comprised lectures with PowerPoint, videos, and group activities. Topics included procedural justice principles, implicit bias, racial profiling, de-escalation, including when dealing with specific types of individuals, homeless, mental health issues, and even domestic violence. You must have the right instructor. There are preconceived notions that this training can diminish the idea of officer safety. I promote procedural justice, but officer safety is important. You can still practice procedural justice and be safe. The Police Academy presented procedural justice training and the concept of community policing. It was ever present throughout the academy and training. It was 5 to 6 days of in-person training. Topics within the procedural justice training were principles of procedural justice, implicit bias, racial profiling, and de-escalation, including dealing with specific types of individuals, homeless, mental health issues, and even domestic violence. The training taught officers to slow down, explain the interaction procedures, and build rapport. Procedural justice is peppered throughout the department training and is taken seriously. So this is, the training that the departments offer. It's procedural justice is taken seriously. Procedural justice there's training in it. The training is meant for the officers to use it, to practice it, right? So they have training in the police academy. They have refresher training annually. They have the initial training for anybody who hadn't received it in the academy when it was first implemented. And then you have the officers or the supervisors and officers practicing it. So post police officer standard training, the training there it's smothered with procedural justice principles. They have different training. They have anywhere from principal policing training to de-escalation training, where they talk about procedural justice, to strategic communication. They talk about procedural justice. And really, procedural justice, that's what it is learning to communicate better in your interactions. Instead of maybe just giving commands and shouting at people or being harsh with people, you're going to communicate with them. Talk to them rather than at them. And, like the saying goes, it's, be fair but firm, right? And so forth. Lastly, a little nod, I guess, to Star Wars, which is one of my favorite, programs or whatever. I like to relate things lots of times to, pop culture, I guess. So in this case, Obi-Wan Kenobi, right, and procedural justice. So what I found through some research in different articles, I use these quotes. Obi-Wan is responsible and respectful. He represents the old ways of the Jedi Order, steadfast, selfless, and modest. So again, a police officer, instilled in our core values of policing, and in the procedural justice principles. Obi-Wan is a role model, right? Obi-Wan follows Qui-Gon Jinn's every move and instruction. Again, talking about the buy-in to procedural justice. Obi-Wan was very respectful towards Qui-Gon, and he learned from Qui-Gon, and so forth. And he believed in what Qui-Gon believed in, right, as far as the Force and so forth. Then we also have, Kenobi's courage, which again, we speak of police officers. Kenobi wouldn't back down from a fight, but he clearly preferred nonviolent solutions to problems. And that's what procedural justice, I think, is about, right? Not using violence, but communicating and being able to talk about things and figure things out, and so forth. I think that's what procedural justice is better communication efforts. When things get heated, he'd always opt for diplomacy over a firefight. One of the tools he used most frequently was a Jedi mind trick, which was designed to diffuse situations before they got out of hand. So again, the Jedi mind trick, was that communication with the citizen, right? Being able to communicate better with them and persuade them, just like a Jedi mind trick would do, persuade someone to do something. Well, our policing communication is like a Jedi mind trick when and being able to persuade someone to do something. And like we said before, it doesn't always work, but even when using force or using a weapon, you still are doing it tactfully, and you're doing it with professionalism, right? And you're doing it legitimately, right? And so forth. So, to effect an arrest, self-defense, defense of others, and so forth, as Obi-Wan Kenobi would do. So, just a little bit of fun stuff there for you, but so forth. So again, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and so forth. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Our article, if you want to read it, it is in the Ohio Committee on Criminal Justice Education Association website in their Criminal Justice Perspectives, Volume 10, Issue 1, right? And so forth. So, so forth. Again, thank you, and go out to all.